started so we can stay on time. Thank you for coming and participating in today's workshop. My name is Pam Wade. I'm with the South Florida Water Management District. I oversee the technical bureau responsible for the Northern Everglades and Estuaries Protection Program at the district. We're here today to begin a rulemaking process that's been directed by the legislature. So it falls under the strategies that have to do with protecting and restoring the Northern Everglades. So rules are needed because they lay out the details that carry out these legislative directives. As you know, the Northern Everglades is quite large and diverse, with unique challenges in each of its three watersheds. That's the importance of these workshops. We want to ensure that we consider specific needs as well as the needs of others in the other areas that are affected. Sometimes what we think works in one area may not work well in another area due to things like geographic differences or even industry differences. So if through these workshops, we're looking to get your input and hope to capture these differences as we take the next steps, which will be to draft rule text that is within the guidelines of what the legislature's intent was. So today we'll start with a presentation by Stephanie Olson, who's been a long-time district scientist and is an expert in the Lake Okeechobee watershed. She was leading the team that is responsible for the rulemaking for Lake Okeechobee. Her presentation will last about 30 minutes, and we ask that you please hold your questions and comments to the end of the presentation. We'll also be available after the meeting so that anyone that wants to do one-on-one discussions, if we're comfortable with that, will be available for that. If you haven't noticed already, we are recording the meetings, so you don't notice that. So, Stephanie.
Good morning. Everybody hear me okay? Welcome to our 40E-61 rulemaking workshop. We're really glad you're here. As Pam mentioned, my presentation is relatively short. It's only about 18 slides, so if you can hold your comments to the end, we really appreciate that. So, before I cover today's topics, I wanted to step back and remind everybody what the existing 40E-61 does. It prescribes how entities can connect to the district surface water management system for the purpose of protecting water resources. So, what I'm going to cover today is why we need to do rulemaking and the affected geographic areas. We're going to also discuss the current water quality conditions, and we'll go through the history of the legislation in the Northern Everglades area and the activities of the agencies involved. We'll also discuss the direction that the legislature has given for this rulemaking update, and we'll discuss some items that we need to think about as we draft these rules. We're also going to present a concept on the draft rule. It is the same one that we presented at our October governing board meeting, but we do have some additional examples to provide you to give you a little bit more feedback. And we will also be covering our timeline and workshop schedule, and we'll wrap up with how you can stay involved in this process. So before we dive into why we're doing rulemaking, I'd like to point your works. Okay, that's working very well. Okay, I will just describe. The purple areas on this map are the Lake Okeechobee watershed basins, and the yellow-orangish colors on the right side of the map is the St. Lucie River watershed, and the green area on the left side of the map is the Coosawhatchee River watershed. And you can see that there is some overlap. So these are the areas that are geographically affected areas. And why we are doing the rulemaking is the Florida statute specifically required the district to revise 40E-61 for the Lake Okeechobee watershed and to develop new rules for the St. Lucie and Coosawhatchee watersheds. And you may be wondering, well, why is the legislature asking us to do that? And this slide shows the current water quality conditions for each of these watersheds, the Northern Everglades watersheds. And the bars on the left-hand side of the graphics represent the restoration goals that are set by the Department of Environmental Protection. DEP sets these goals. They're also called total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs. DEP has also determined these areas to be impaired. So the left-hand side shows our goals, the right-hand side shows the current water quality conditions, so that explains why restoration is necessary in these areas. Now I'd like to discuss a little bit about the restoration efforts in the Northern Everglades watersheds. It all began in 1987 with something called the Surface Water Improvement and Management Act. And there was a portion of that act, specifically the number was 373.4595, it's a Florida statute, that was specific to Lake Okeechobee. Since then, though, there has been many statutory changes. And today, that statute, that same number, is now known as the Northern Everglades and Estuaries Protection Program, or the NEEP statute. So I'm not going to go through all the changes, but there are a couple things on this slide that I do want to highlight to you. There's also another statute, 403.067, that governs the total maximum daily loads, the restoration goals we talked about, and how DEP determines that water bodies are impaired. And in 2005, that statute was amended to say that DEP could use something called Basin Management Action Plans, or BMAPs, to develop these restoration plans. In 2007, that's when the 373.4595 statute was amended to include the river watersheds, and it became known as the NEEP. Between 2012 and 2014, DEP adopted basin management action plans for the 3 Northern Everglades watersheds. Then in 2016, there were changes made to NEEP again. It was amended to say that DEP now must use basin management action plans for the Northern Everglades watershed. So now they have to do that. The other thing that happened in 2016 was when the district was told that we needed to revise 40E-61. And because of the many statutory changes, the underlying authorities for 40E-61 have changed. So that essentially means that the district must start from scratch, because the existing rule is obsolete. And the other thing that happened in 2016 is the coordinating agency roles and activities were revised. And I have a slide for that next. So this slide kind of lays out what those roles are. DEP is taking the lead on water quality through the basin management action plans. And I should mention that the 3 coordinating agencies are the Department of Environmental Protection, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and the South Florida Water Management District. So DAX has the lead on agricultural EMPs, and the Water Management District has a lead on hydrologic improvements through the watershed protection plans, which consists of the research and water quality monitoring programs and the watershed construction projects. And Chapter 40E-61, or the Works of the District program, is a program under those watershed protection plans. So that's where it fits into the big picture. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the specifics of what the 2016 statute directed for 40E-61. As I mentioned previously, we have to revise the existing rules that were for Lake Okeechobee. We have to develop the new rules for Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie River watersheds. These rules must be consistent with the NEEP itself, and they must be consistent with 403.067. Remember, that was that statute that covers the TMDLs and basin management action plans. The rules must provide a monitoring program for people or entities not including EMPs, and these could be ag or non-ag EMPs. The other thing that the NEEP requires is a research and water quality monitoring program. Now this slide depicts a little bit more one of the inconsistencies that we have right now. The map on the left-hand side shows our existing 40E-61 boundary, and the map on the right shows the neat boundary, and you can see even the Lake Okeechobee watershed has expanded since the original rules. So this is an area that we will need to do some changes. Now, before I bring up the draft context or concept of the rule, I wanted to explain a few things that we need to consider while we're doing this rulemaking. And I do want to begin with speaking a little bit on the topic. I know there was a lot of comments that we received at our October governing board. There seemed to be disappointment that we weren't bringing out draft rule text at this point. And our concern was that if we came out with draft text at this point, because the watershed is so large, it's about 5 million acres, and it's very diverse. I mean, there's urban areas, there's agricultural areas. Our concern was that we might have something that would work for 60%, but maybe for the remaining 40 would be totally impractical. So that's why we're coming out today with concepts, but you will have opportunity because once we have text drafted, we're going to come out and do workshops again. So don't think that you will not have opportunity to come on text. It is coming. But some things that we need to think about while we're doing this rulemaking is we need to look at what do the statutes say that this rule can do. And we also need to look at gaps, maybe in the restoration plans. Is there a gap that these rules can fill in that's within the district's statutory authority that could assist with achieving the goals that we want to achieve? We need to look at water quality conditions. We want to avoid duplication with other regulatory programs. And I will be presenting today, again, the draft concept for you to review. And we definitely want stakeholder input because we want to have a practical rule. So with that, here is the draft concept, which consists of essentially 3 components. The first component is to have a monitoring component, which will be in 2 parts. The first part, remember, we need to provide requirements for those not implementing BMPs, either through DACs or through DEP. We need to have that. The second part of the monitoring would be looking at the district's existing network and seeing how we could use that to represent nutrient levels in contributing areas and take the data from that to support research projects, to look at how nutrient reduction technologies are working, and maybe identify areas where we need to implement additional projects. So it would basically be used to inform the decisions that the coordinating agencies are making on actions. So after we collect that data from that existing monitoring network that the district has, we need to have some way of assessing what that data is telling us. So we need to consider what types of those things we would put in the rules. And then we need to define the conditions where actions may need to be taken and identify what those actions may be. So I'm going to get into a little bit more details on the concept in a moment, but I want you to consider some things as you're sitting and thinking about things that you might want to comment on. First of all, we all need to remember, as I said, the geographic area is quite large and quite diverse. So somebody might have an idea that would work for one area, but it may cause a severe hardship on another set of stakeholders. So we need to try to work through those things. We also want to make sure that, we'll accept all ideas, but each idea will have to be taken back and compared to what our legislative directions are to see if we have the authority to do various things. And we need to make sure that the rules are reasonable and implementable. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and go into the concepts and give you a little bit more flavor for some ideas. These are just some examples we have. I'm sure there's many others out there and that you may have ideas that you can give during our comment period and open house. So the first part of the monitoring component was to consider what requirements we need to have for those that are monitoring rather than implementing BMPs. This is going to have to be consistent with the statewide requirements. DEP has a statewide monitoring rule, which we did have as handouts. Maybe you guys picked that up outside. So we'll have to be consistent, but maybe we could be more specific with various things with our requirements. But we also have to remember what is practical. I know we've also gotten a lot of feedback at the board meetings about monitoring in this area and how that would be done. So we'll have to consider that. And there might be other components, other ideas that you have on this. Now for the second part of the monitoring component, we want to review the district's existing and proposed monitoring network. And we also gave some handouts on that. We have maps of each of the 3 areas. And we have our existing and proposed monitoring on those maps. I really wish these pages were close. I was working there for a minute. The red squares are our basin level monitoring. That's where we have both measurements of flow and concentration, so we can calculate loads. And then within a hydrologic area or a basin upstream of that, we have what we call our upstream monitoring, which on these maps are depicted as green for existing and yellow for where our proposed green monitoring is going to be met. So we need to review this and see how this can be used to enhance these rules, and we also need to consider if other types of monitoring is needed and what other components may need to be factored into this. And on each of the little handouts, I should mention that this table is for the entire Northern Everglades area, so each individual map has a table for specific to that watershed. So after we have the data, we need to consider how we're going to assess that data. We might want to look at long-term trends. We need to identify different types of statistical tests we're going to use on the data, whether it be averages or trend analysis. And then we want to consider various factors. For example, there might be a basin that has a very nice decreasing trend in nutrients, but something called the unit area load, which is basically the pounds per acre for that basin or region, is very high. So would we want to, would we want that to trigger an action, even though it's decreasing, but it still has high unit area loads compared to other areas of the watershed? You might want to consider location, how close it is to the downstream receiving body. So those are the kinds of things that we need to consider. And then, of course, we need to consider various types of actions. And as I said, there may be many more than what we have as examples here today. But we would certainly want to communicate our findings to our coordinating agency partners so they could consider maybe if they need to reevaluate BMPs. Our expanded monitoring network, we're going to have a collection of various types of like the species. So we'll know whether the phosphorus is dissolved or it's particulate. So perhaps if we find an area that has a lot of particulate phosphorus, then we can let DAC and DEP know so that they can focus projects in those areas that will address sediment controls for those types of areas. We may, the one action could be triggering additional water quality investigations. Maybe we see something, but we feel like we really need to get a better handle on that area before we would go into further actions. They could trigger the implementation of additional regional projects, such as stormwater treatment areas, like the Lakeside Ranch SDA. Or it could trigger improved water management systems. There's a cost share program with Southwest called the Farms Program. We've left some of those brochures to the side as well. This cost share program that Southwest has cost shares the implementation of tailwater recovery systems. And that might be something that we could consider. So those are basically the concepts that we have that we'd like you to start thinking about. And like as you said, you may have other ideas. So now I'm going to go into our rulemaking. We are at this first line doing our workshops with the concepts. But as I said, we're going to take all the feedback we get from these workshops that we're doing in various areas to make sure we can meet with as many stakeholders as possible. And we're going to go back and we're going to draft rule text, which may take a couple iterations, but we're going to draft some rule text, and we hope to come back out sometime in January and do workshops again in the same locations and get your input on the text that we've drafted. So there will be opportunity for you to comment on that as well when we have it. And here's our workshop number 1 schedule. Today's meeting is Okeechobee, but we are going to do this same workshop in Fort Myers, Kissimmee, Stewart, and West Palm Beach so that we can get feedback from other areas. And I want to thank you guys for coming today. You can stay involved by, giving your comments. You can, comment during the public comment period, or you can stay for the open house, or we have on our rulemaking website, there's an area where you can go and leave a comment there, or you can give us your handwritten comments as well. We take comments in all forms. And that's really all I have. So we will open it up for comments and questions.
Just a quick question. Do you have a time frame for submitting comments from this workshop?
No. We didn't really list a specific time frame, but it would be good, since we're going to hopefully start drafting rule text beginning of December. It would be great if you could get your comments to us by the end of this month so that we could have it while we're considering drafting the text. That was a good question. Thank you. Yes?
A comment, Stephanie. I was actually going through some of the stuff in my office. I'm West Louis, Louis Cattle Company. Yesterday I came across where my grandfather purchased the land in 1948. I'm third generation cattle rancher, but there are some people in this room that are 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th generation cattle ranchers in this area. Just be real careful in the rulemaking not to have unintended consequences. An example would be the tax that was implied or put it on some of the land south of the lake, which basically calls on the cleanest agricultural operations, cattle ranching, to do that business. Cattle ranchers, I can tell you from generations, do not have a large cash flow. If you put another tax on them, it's hardly good. That could result in what my dad would call private property, that's selling cattle ranch, cows and all. But besides that, you can also regulate ag business. So just be careful about those unintended consequences from the rulemaking.
Okay. Thank you for that comment. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Doug Bordy for the University, and our group started BMPs in 1998. Chairman of our committee, Steve Carter, got an award from the Commissioner of Ag for outstanding environmental contributions to the state of Florida for initiating the first regional agricultural BMP in the state. And that was any citrus BMPs. That's morphed into citrus BMPs and morphed into others. We have been engaged with this because our growers first kicked me out of the very first meeting where I suggested we be proactive. They excused me from my own office, from my own meeting. They said, "You're out of here." I had to lobby them individually to say, "Listen, if you do this, one, you're helping the environment, and 2, you're going to save money." I had to sit down and explain to them how a smart sprayer would save them money, how certain things, new equipment would save them money, how collecting fertilizer with a plastic shield underneath the loading station where their grandfather used to load fertilizer, they could scoop it up, put it back. After we sat down, they lobbied all 16 guys. I got back in the room, and the carrot was they saved money, and then they saw the improvements of their own environment, their own water quality on their own ranch and their growth. It's so popular that we advertise it in Europe and Japan that we have EMPs, and our water quality leaving our citrus groves is cleaner than the water we get from the Water Management District. We've had the entire governing board of South Florida out to Evans property in a 10,000-acre grove to show them with a computer monitoring the water coming in from the C-23 canal and then leaving. The water was much enhanced and much cleaner. And they told me 9 or 8 years ago when they left, you guys are good to go. And I'm surprised we're here yet again to prove that we are some of the best stewards of the water quality and in the environment. I'm mystified why we're here, because Ag has embraced EMP statewide. Every group has, yet we're coming under more monitoring and more attack. As Ag leaves, rooftops and septic tanks are coming in into the Kissimmee River Valley, and that's been the tipping point for Lake Okeechobee. It's not the people around the lake, it's been what's north of the lake. It's the septic tanks. Same thing on the Indian River Lagoon. There used to be 240,000 acres of citrus on the east coast, right on the barrier island and along the lagoon, because we had to load up the original steamers, taking mule carts out on the docks and loading it along the river. And now all that is gone, and it's rooftops of septic tanks. We have massive new algae blooms in Banana and Mosquito River and Indian River. The tipping point isn't agriculture, it's the urban transition. And I urge you to focus on that more so than Ag. Ag's been a good steward of its environment and of its water source.
Thank you for your comment.
Before you go on,
Okay.
just want to make sure that you understand that this rule isn't going to be focusing on the EMPs. The EMPs are being led by DAX and DEP. So what we're trying to do is focus on the monitoring aspect. So DEP and DAX rely on us to have appropriate monitoring in to show how well things are going, whether it be for projects or EMPs. So just so that you know, our focus is the research and the monitoring. Or control.
There was something over here first, I wanted to, yes.
West Carlton, to play on what Doug was saying, there's a lot of us that spent 20 plus years and a lot of money between personal and working with different agencies. And can you pull up the map for St. Lucie watershed? Can you zoom in on St. Lucie in particular?
I will try.
So make sure that we get your comments recorded. Walk around with my phone.
This work?
Yeah.
State your
So I think several of you are already done, so if you could just say who you are and who you're representing.
If you can, we can follow on the map.
Yeah, that's about as close as I get. We do have posters.
Do you have one to look at?
Wes, you need this one.
Yeah, right
The
here.
one-
You want that one?
Right here.
I got one, I'll make sure she has one.
Yeah, we've got one right here.
All right, with what Doug's saying, we've all spent a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort trying to do things right. And everybody needs to do their part, and we all agree on that. But if you, in particular, go to C-23, and if you follow, everybody follow this. The way I understand this, your monitoring points, the yellow dot proposed upstream, there is nothing downstream of I-95. If I'm reading that correctly. That bank of C-23 is lined with houses and septic systems. I think in fairness, we need to be monitoring somewhere downstream.
You're talking about in this area here.
C-23, you see the 2 yellow dots, those are proposed monitoring sites.
Right. But you're saying, you're asking us to monitor in this area.
Well, I think we
East
need
of
to be.
95, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to make sure I understand where. Okay.
Actually, I think, I don't know, most of our monitoring stations for St. Lucie are along the coast.
Well, none of these are showing anything in 23 east of I-95.
I think he's specific for this
Oh,
canal.
that's, you know,
Does everybody follow that?
Yeah.
Part of what we are trying to do with monitoring, it's not easy to monitor just anywhere that you want to monitor. A lot of it has to do with getting access, and even if we have access, there's safety issues. And then when we select these locations, what's the benefit of the location? What area is it representing? So
And that's my point.
Yeah, so when we selected locations, we had to consider all of these things. And there may be a point in the future where we may have to move some of these locations around, but we're not able to get sampling locations in place to represent 100% of the watershed. What we've done so far is gotten the best that we could at this point.
I don't think this is the best. You need another sample east of 95. That way it would be, right now, all you're checking is ag water. You're not checking all the runoff from Port St. Lucie and Home City.
Well, Carmela, do you wanna, Carmela's our expert on the St. Lucie watershed, so she knows where these monitoring locations are. I'm gonna come up to the microphone. And we actually have several locations that are representative of the non-ag areas, and it's actually most of our
Does
original.
anybody see that on this map? Is it on this map? I don't know.
So what we represent in this map is we have, for the St. Lucie watershed, we have a combination of two tiers. So the points in yellow are upstream monitoring locations that we will be starting. And they are just sample locations where the district had access, and that represented a large portion of the basin where we are doing the monitoring. Besides that, we also have a tier 1 monitoring that occurs at the main structure that represents the entire C22.
The main structure is upstream of the discharge by several miles on C-23. Before, the structure on C-23 at Boat Ramp Road is several miles before the canal empties into the estuary. I think we need to check between the 2 points. We don't have to get in the weeds on this, but the same way on C-25, it goes through the whole part of town, and it's all septic up there. We just, in fairness, we need to check them all.
Yes, and I think that I think that right now probably we can prepare a little bit better to describe the locations, because we have tried to capture a wide array of uses, and we also have several stations on the east that capture urban areas as well.
That's what he's asking for. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just I really completely with him, and I live in that watershed, and I travel exactly those routes all the time. What he is saying is very valid. We've got a huge septic tank problem. St. Lucie County knows they've got a problem where that urban versus ag interface happens, and when we're seeing more swap from agriculture to urban, we need to know what's going on there. Thank you.
Okay, so we're actually still in the process of nailing down the expanded monitoring locations. So if you have a specific location that you think we can access and that you think is representative of an area that you have concerns over.
You have right of way down the whole
You own the
canal, and
canals.
you own the canal and the right of way down either side, especially east of 95. You can do whatever you want.
We'll look at those.
Thank you. Now, by the way, there's no monitoring on Sewell's Point either, just by the way.
Put that down.
Well, just in summary, we're working to monitor in locations that are representative of all areas in the watershed. It's not perfect, but we're doing the best we can based on accessibility and things like that. So if there's an area that you think we've missed, we'll certainly make note of it and go out and see if we can fill in those gaps.
And just for clarification, these green dots, the ones that are SLT,
Tony Federico. Just for clarification, the green dots that are labeled SLT, haven't those stations been discontinued many years ago?
No, the green dots are the St. Lucie Crystal network, and no,
I thought the district discontinued that network years
There was a
ago.
larger network that represented SLT. Some of those sites were discontinued.
So all of these are active?
The ones that are green are now.
Good morning, everyone. Gary Ritter. I'm representing the Florida Farm Bureau Federation and a lot of farmers and ranchers from all over the state of Florida. I first want to kind of reiterate some things to understand, make sure I understand what you all have said, because of course we had without any rule text right now, we had many concerns coming into this meeting. So first, what I heard you say is that you all, or this program will be supporting the BMAP blueprint, which means, in my mind, that you all will be monitoring and collaborating with the other coordinating agencies. You all also said that you're going to avoid any kind of duplication with other programs. So in other words, what I hear you saying is that the FDAX program is going to be the program that will be implementing the agricultural BMPs. And that, you're not going to get involved in implementation of agricultural BMPs. And that I heard you say that the monitoring network, once it's been established, you will begin to try to make some decisions collaborating with the other coordinating agencies that are listed in 373, 4595. And
Yes.
I did hear you say that part of this program, you are going to look at gaps. And by looking at gaps, I'm thinking you're going to be looking at urban BMPs or the likes thereof, and the need for urban BMPs in those areas where your water quality monitoring network might be defining issues that aren't kind of what he was saying, defining those areas that might not be a problem with agriculture.
Gary, in the same way that you described that DAX is the lead for BMPs for agriculture, DEP is the lead for BMPs for non-ag.
Okay.
So we will present water quality. That data may show things are going great in some areas and not so great in other areas. So when we present data on areas that are not going so great, the agencies will collectively decide what needs to be done in those areas. This rule is to help support that kind of decision making based on science, data, and working with the lead agencies for whatever the issue may be. When it comes to projects, in some of those, it's a district that's the lead. But when it comes to BMPs, it's a DEP or not.
Okay, and your monitoring network will then eventually identify needs for other areas that might need to be monitored in order to hone in on those issues that you might not be aware of.
That's one potential use of the data.
Yes. The other, I think, right with that suite of kind of reiterating what I think you all have said, I think many of us, the biggest concern is I mean, I suspect everyone here kind of likes that approach that you're looking at. However, your governing board has not necessarily, are not necessarily in lockstep, at least from what I've heard at the governing board meetings, with that kind of approach. And I know you can't respond to that, but I sense, and I hope that I'm wrong, that the governing board would like a bit more regulatory oversight on all of this. And I hope that's not the case. I hope that they come to the realization that the coordinating agencies are there. They each have their specific roles, and they are there to help move us along in this process and improve water quality in the basin. So I'll just leave that. You don't even need to respond to that. But lastly, since you all are going to be looking at research and looking at, different issues in the watershed, one of the things, and I think many of us understand that there's a legacy issue, and the legacy issue it is in many cases a result of flood control canals that have been created in the northern watershed. And it would be nice to see, if you're going to be doing some research, if you could evaluate the nutrient dynamics that are going on in these flood control canals. Because agriculture's been on this watershed for many decades. And the real water quality problems that came about started when the flood control system was put in up here north of the watershed. So I think a nutrient dynamic analysis of these canals, S191, Indian Prairie, Harney Pond, all of those areas might be in order.
That's good comment, Gary, because that's really what this monitoring network and the research component is for, things like that. So we have the ability to maybe initiate some things related to legacy fees, both the monitoring data as well as the research component that we're trying to develop.
So, go ahead. You got it first.
Natalie Pikes, One Florida Foundation. I just want to bounce on that a minute because I know of a couple of properties that are adjacent to, particularly in the Taylor Slough region, or the Taylor Creek region, I'm sorry. I know of a couple of properties where they have got soil sampling happening on their actual property from the dredge that happened for those flood control canals, and the soil that was put back on the property when they dredged those canals was really high in phosphorus. So I think there's a lot to be said for that legacy and for what our flood control system has created as far as what we've sort of applied to people's land that wasn't necessarily theirs per se, or maybe it was generations back, right? And now they're having to own it, which I think is part of the problem with putting things too much on any particular property owner. Because we've just done so much moving about of nutrients in this state, we're really not talking about specific sources, we're talking about a lot of flow and a lot of movement of nutrients. So just keep that in mind with that flood control system, because I think there's a lot to be said for the nutrient loading in those canals and adjacent to those canals. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment.
Paul Ray Baldwin. I'm just looking at this map, and part of the up in Highlands County and Polk County, the Lake Wells Ridge, large parts of that are in the Southwest Florida Water Management District that drain to South Florida. This rule will include that area.
It does. We would probably end up having an agreement.
Okay, yeah, I think that'd be a good idea if you could figure out how to do it. Thank you.
Pam, on the monitored frequencies, are you going to measure flow?
Most of these upstream sites do not have flow, but the main structures are looking at the. So all of the red, like in the map that's on the screen right now, all of the red sites have flow. We realize.
The red, oh, the red squares.
Yes. So we in DP Index, we all realize that flow is coming out. And so we're working with each other to try to figure out how we can get more flow monitoring. It's difficult, just like it's, hard north of the lake to any flow monitoring anywhere done this major structure. So it's even harder to select sites for flow monitoring than it is to select sites for these ground samples. So we're working with the other agencies to try to come up with the highest priority sites for load measurement and how that would be done.
Because without, it's going to make relative interpretations.
So really, load is, we prioritize load in the place, so those are the road sites for base and line. These grab sites, the ones with no load, are for upstream, more investigated upstream, where load has been identified already be a higher priority. So that's how it's kind of prioritized. You can't do everything everywhere, there's limited resources, limited funds. So you go where the highest loads are to start, and then you go to these upstream sites, the ones that are shown on the map as really low, that is concentration, and do more investigative work. And at that point, we might decide, well, this is a higher priority basin, this is low, we might need to do low monitoring, complex flows.
Hi, good morning. Beth Lewis with the Nature Conservancy. You know, similar to what Gary said, Pam and Stephanie, I think that we're starting to get more clarity around what the scope of this rule would be. And so, you know, many of us came in here not exactly knowing what we were going to focus on, so that's really helpful. So thank you very much. I do want to step back a little bit and just provide a couple bigger picture comments, because I know that we're drilling down into many of the details, but y'all had asked for just a few comments on some of the bigger picture. So I'd like to start by saying that the Nature Conservancy is a large landholder within the northern reaches of the Lake Okeechobee watershed. And we have spent years, since the 70s, working with ranchers and other large landowners to preserve wildlife corridors and to preserve land for water storage. So it's really critical to us. The one issue that really hasn't been touched on, except for just a little bit by Mr. Williamson, was about economic viability. And that is a huge issue. We've got to make sure that we can maintain these habitats. And the way that we retain those habitats is through our work with the ranching community. And I know you're going to have to do economic analysis as part of this, rulemaking process and the Administrative Procedures Act, and that's going to affect, obviously, some of the outcome of the rules. But I just wanted to emphasize that. Just a couple of other things. Looking at these, we have a lot more notes. Again, I see that you've identified some more specifics to the rule concept, so I haven't had an opportunity to really think about that level of detail. But I think, it would be very helpful when you talk about the scope of authority, and I, appreciate hearing that you all are very sensitive to that, because clearly your legislative mandates, somewhat complicated as they are laid out in statute. That's going to be very important for you for the integrity of the rulemaking process when you ultimately get to that part of the process. But I think that this idea of y'all, monitoring and looking at those non-point sources that are not BMP compliant or that are not, have not opted into the BMP program, so people will be in lieu of, is going to be an important part of this effort. So the focus there, I think, is appropriate. And then again, this idea of taking action, I'm not sure. The slide on the tailwater recovery system that was out there, I don't know if you were going to talk about that a little more closely, but I think that in itself might raise some concerns for people here in this room when we talk about exactly who you're going to be monitoring, what some of those actions that you're going to be taking are. So just for whatever it's worth. Thank you.
I think you touched on unintended consequences and the comment here, and we're very sensitive to that, and that's where I think these workshops will come in handy. We know everything about each of your specific situations in every area, so those unintended consequences from certain concepts are a big part of what we're talking about. And then on the tailwater recovery, that's just one example of things that if an area is considered to be a high priority area, it's either going to be a concentration issue or a flow issue. So there would be opportunities for cost sharing, some BMPs through DEX or DEP, and water management cost share programs. Farms program may end up being tailwater recovery type system, it's a flow issue. So those are just examples of some things that could be done, and they could be built into a cost share type program. Anyone who might be in a priority area, still talking conceptual, would probably be higher priority for cost share funds.
Pam, I did Gary Ritter again. I just wanted to follow up on the tailwater recovery systems. We've met with several governing board members there's a citrus grower over in Lee County and also has growth here in Highlands County. They have put in a tailwater recovery system, and one of the challenges that they have found, and actually they put one in the Southwest Florida Water Management District. One of the challenges that they found in the South Florida Water Management District is that system has been somewhat arduous to get permitted. So I think if you're going to move forward with these types of projects, maybe somehow look at streamlining the permitting process for these operators, because they can provide good water conservation and water quality benefits to the watershed.
Brad Ferris. Those of us in the ranching community are some of the easiest people to get along with, and we want to do what's right and we want to help, and we have a track record of doing that. And we're usually pretty diplomatic about things, but every once in a while, diplomacy gets a little tiring. So I'm just going to be blunt and honest. This process, to me, so far, smacks of being skewed in favor of the urban areas and against agriculture. From what Mr. Carlton pointed out earlier, to looking at the Lake Okeechobee map and the proposed sites for monitoring, one of the densest areas that we have for urban growth is along the I-4 corridor, and there's nothing proposed up in that area at the headwaters. No proposed sites on the map I'm looking at. So again, if we're going to be fair about it, let's monitor all the sites and all the areas of interest and fill in those gaps. We've talked about it, and from what I've heard so far, you guys have kind of tap danced around it. As we said earlier, you have access, you have the right of ways to the canals. There's no reason there shouldn't be monitoring in those more urban areas. And secondly, you had a slide up earlier that showed all the proposed workshops. Every location is at 10 o'clock in the morning, except for Stewart, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Very convenient for all of the people in the urban area to get there after work or at the end of the day and voice their concerns, where we make it a little more difficult for the working people in the ag community to get to these things without having to make a huge effort, and it just, to me, smacks of being a little bit discriminatory. So I think we should try to be a little more equitable about how we schedule these things, when we schedule them, and make it the same for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I did want to explain that there is monitoring in the headwaters area. It's just not district monitoring. DEP has worked with several of the communities up there and different districts, like Reedy Creek Improvement District, and there is monitoring. So that might be something we could look at with those rules, but that's why we did not propose any district monitoring up there, because there was some. So yeah, we wanted to avoid duplication, and we will also try to. We heard your comment on the timing, and we will try to schedule workshops at different types of times in various places in the future.
So that was totally unintentional, and as far as how the workshop came out, we were trying to squeeze in as many as we could before the end of November, and it had to do with, who had a venue that we could have. We were trying to cram 2 workshops in one day. So that is why we even asked at one of the last EMAP meetings, would growers prefer morning or evening, and we got a totally different responses depending on who we talk to. So if you would prefer the Okeechobee meeting, the next round would be in the evening, we'll certainly do that if that's what your preference is. That's not a problem.
Artis Sam, I have a question. Why is there no monitoring listed in Lee County at all that I can see on the map? And also, why is there no monitoring Hutchinson Island area?
Lee County is, again, similar to the, what Stephanie just described. That's already being monitored by local entities. If it's a communication, their data can be used. The executive district to go out and set up monitoring where they're already monitoring. Hutchinson Island is not a tributary to the Northern Everglades, and this rule is specific to the Northern Everglades.
So why is it there key on the map to show those locals so that we actually know what is the monitoring on the local people? It's not just some phantom monitoring somewhere that nobody in the public knows about. Okay, good point.
We can do that. Yeah. We have maps that show exactly that one.
I believe it should be incorporated if you're going to show all the monitoring that you're going to rely on for the data.
Madeline Pipestone, Florida Foundation. Just following up, I keep hearing you say we can rely on or we can utilize. I guess the question is, are we going to? That local data. Thank you.
Thank you, Benita, for being patient.
No, that's no problem. Benita Whalen, Florida Cattlemen's Association. One item with the monitoring, I just like to make sure that the intent of some of the new monitoring station captures input upstream of lake systems that we know, have started to trend, like Lake Okeechobee with the loss of assimilative capacity. I think in the past, some of the efforts assumed that different natural systems and lake areas, we didn't need to focus in those areas because we would get the natural system to help with some of the water quality and flow issues. But we're realizing Istopolia, Lake Kissimmee, others that, and I think your monitoring shows that, but I just wanted to mention that. And then I did want to say that I think Pam and Stephanie, you both mentioned the intent of the legislation, the NEEP legislation. And I think it's more obvious from your approach that the coordinating agencies getting back to utilizing as many resources and expertise as possible, and collaborating and working together to get some of the needed improvements. I think that's very positive based on your comments today. And I would just like to close with, I know the Cattlemen's Association would like to thank your board members for having come out, taking the time to come out to the watershed, see the landscape. I think there's additional ones planned, and I think the association really appreciates their time and efforts to see what's on the landscape, and for them to have an opportunity to talk to them about some of these pressing issues, and that they can see for themselves all of the services that ag provides in this watershed.
Thank you.
John Small, County Foods. My question is, you have in yellow proposed upstream monitoring sites, and you have in green existing upstream monitoring sites, and you in your legend list bi-weekly frequency of monitoring. About a month ago, we sat in this room and saw data presented by DEP for a lot of these monitoring sites, and I don't remember 26 data points on an annual basis for an awful lot of these monitoring sites. So are you proposing additional monitoring on some of these green sites, or are you already bi-weekly monitoring?
That's a really good question. In August, our governing board approved the green sites going to a frequency of bi-weekly. For the last about 5 years, they've been elected monthly. So that is a proposed increase that the board just approved. Oh, yes, and they approved the increase in parameters as well. The green in the past had just been, for the most part, total phosphorus. There's total nitrogen at a couple of the sites, well, I should say a couple, some of the sites in Lakeville, some of the sites in St. Lucie, but for the most part, the green sites were all previously just total phosphorus.
So now all of the green and yellow sites will be bi-weekly with nitrogen and phosphorus.
Rick Harden, in those green sites on the St. Lucie River, will you be putting fecal coliform and those kind of things? Because that seems to be in the St. Lucie River a really big problem when we have no discharges. They're closing down the river because of fecal coliform, and that's something that I think needs to be checked as well.
The district for this rule, it's confused names of this, but there are other entities that will be considering doing bacteria fecal type monitoring, like the Green Task Force. They may end up doing that in their local health departments. So that would be other agencies. That wouldn't be something that would be addressed in this rule.
Good morning, Doug Gaston, Audubon, Florida. So a couple of weeks ago, based on the recommendation of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, the governor announced some new legislation that he'll be proposing around septic tanks and VMPs, updating those and making sure they're based on best science and all that. At the same time, DEP is in the process of updating the BMAP, which I believe it's supposed to have some type of draft document out in a couple of weeks and try to finalize by the end of the year or early into next year. With this process going into next year, how does it inform those two processes and try to, how will this be incorporated into those two processes?
We have been working with DEP, they're the liaison BMAPs, literally on a weekly basis to coordinate all of the monitoring so that they're selecting sites that they feel would be beneficial in BMAPs. So they're looking at not only the district monitoring sites, these expanded sites, they're looking at these other entities like Lee County, for St. Lucie, who does monitoring. So they're incorporating their monitoring sites into BMAP, that's their decision. But we're doing a lot of the technical legwork for them to help them identify sites. And they're picking up all of the yellow sites that we've proposed. They had most of the green sites in their monitoring plan. So when that monitoring plan comes out, it'll have been a coordinated effort with the district as well as all of the other entities monitoring in the areas that would represent the BMAP and the data that they use.
Katie Bush, for English Brothers. You said you were using data from other sources. Are they going to be using the same monitoring parameters?
The data from the other sources is collectively what DEP is using for BMAP. So if the district is using the green and yellow sites, that's one of the things that we can consider as we go into this rulemaking. Is one of the concepts was investigative work. If there's an area that seems to need some investigative work or some data triggers that, then we would go look at what are other sources of data, the BMAP data sites. That would be an option that we would do. But the district doesn't routinely consider the data by all entities that DEP necessarily does. If there are some situations where we will go look at other areas, like sometimes we'll get requests about water quality in certain areas, and we will take a look at some of the data that other entities are collecting and provide that along with what we have. But
So how does that work with the areas that you don't have monitoring systems where you're saying that other entities are monitoring? How are you going to integrate that?
It's all integrated through the BMAP. So.
Okay.
Question. Wes Carlson again. This is smelling fishier and fishier. If you're going to be pulling water samples, and we're all in this together, and we're all trying to do our parts, why would you not, in collaboration with all the other agencies that we're supposed to be playing nice with, Why not do every possible thing we can do to find out what the problem is? Let's look for fecal bacteria, let's look for anything. The way this is looking, you're just pointing right at ag. You're looking, you're singling us out. And I would like to see a map, and I think everybody else in here would, where Kate was headed, is let's see where all these other agencies have monitoring, what they're monitoring for, how often. I think we need to see that.
Yeah, that's a good comment, and that is exactly what DEP is doing right now with the DMAP that they're having to update for January. That's their role. The other comment you made, as far as the fecal, one of the things that we have to ensure that we stay within our authority for the 40E-61 rule, and what the legislation has said is that we'll focus on nutrients. As a matter of fact, in Lake Okeechobee watershed, it is specific to phosphorus only, and in the other watersheds, it's phosphorus and nutrient. But we see that it's coming down the pipe. DEP is getting ready to look at nutrients, nitrogen in Lake Okeechobee, sort of picking those up. But when it comes to bacterial, we don't have the authority to do this rule necessarily through the NAEP process, or the Related Protection Program process, to do people. However, there are other agencies that are taking that on. If you've been keeping up with the Blue Green Algae Task Force, one of the agencies is the Health Department. They've recommended that the septic program be taken over by DEP. There are other avenues for that to occur. It's not the district's role.
Okay.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, if there, you did talk a little bit about data gaps, and if there's gaps in certain sector data, whether it be urban, agriculture, industrial, commercial, how are those going to be picked up? What agency will fill in those gaps? Will the district be filling in the gaps? Or if there's gaps in the urban sector, will DEP be filling those gaps when they're identified? How will that?
Good question. It depends. So the three agencies are working together to decide how to fill in those gaps. It's not like there's unlimited funds to do that. As a matter of fact, with the upstream monitoring in years past, we actually moved sites around to optimize as time goes on based on what data is showing. We continue to need collection at certain sites. Maybe we have other sites that are higher priority because a past site maybe is looking like the water quality is in a good range. So DEP and the district and Blue Green Algae Task Force, we're all talking about how we can fund these additional sites and how we can fund additional parameters. So it's a very coordinated effort among the agencies. Maybe they'll do fecal at one of the sites we found to be accessible, but they would be the ones maybe paying for the extra parameters that are not authorized under our rule. So things like that are happening, pretty much discussions like that are happening routinely, regularly, as we go through this process.
My name is Gary Lee. I'm from Kissimmee with Southport Ranch. It seems that there are, and I hear you say there's other people doing monitoring. How do you assess the monitoring if it's not all on the table? And if everybody in this room don't know what you're actually looking at, there is probably no less than at least 6 tributaries to Lake Toho. And all you have to do is look at Lake Toho. Lake Toho is probably the next dead lake in the state of Florida. So that in turn would tell you that it is a major source of pollutants, especially with nutrients. I know you're looking at doing a new hydrilla project to do some analysis. But all those sources, all those tributaries are not monitored. Getting up into Orange County all the way across that basin, you're not going to be dealing with the actual nutrient load that gets to Lake Okeechobee.
DEP is actually going through an exercise right now to try to ensure that every tributary is monitored. It's not a simple task, and it may be something that occurs over years. But one of the concepts that we're proposing for the rule is to do investigatory work. And it could be that the rule would say that we would consider other entity data. So when we say that the district's not responsible for all of that collection, we don't pay for it, we don't have people go out and do collection, that doesn't mean that the data is not accessible to us and available for public use. So when we set up any kind of investigative work that's triggered by some high or increasing trend conditions, we can state that other data should be considered for that investigation.
All right, it does kind of seem like that you mentioned years down the road on collecting this, getting this data from other people. Looking at your calendar with not some of this stuff already being in effect, possibly before you got this information.
There's data that's available today, but there may be sites, for example, the flow sites. Those may take a little longer to get installed, selecting locations, get installations out, getting funding for those. Those may take a year or two to get several in place. But there's quite a bit of monitoring in place today with years worth of history. So we've got, but there's still gaps. I mean, you all have pointed out several places where there are gaps. It's not a perfect system. So to be able to fill in every tributary, every gap, not that that's our goal for this year, but that may be something that is determined to be necessary in future years. At this point, we don't have the funding to monitor every single tributary in all three watersheds. It's just too massive.
Are you also looking at the huge number of roadways from Central Florida all the way down here that there are no retention systems whatsoever? Including, for example, I've got some pictures at the Canoe Creek Service Plaza where literally the runoff is collected, but it's killed everything in the world in your ditch. And in this situation, that is the state of Florida. It is DOT. So there's literally some internal things within the various state agencies that should also be reviewed.
Yeah, good point. And I think that was one of the Viability Task Force recommendations, is to relook at environmental resource permitting, which is responsible for stormwater. So you'll see that coming through them.
Susan Goslin, Osceola County. I will tell you that we are monitoring the northern watershed. We are all following FDEP protocols for monitoring. We use NELAP labs. In Osceola County, we entered into the Lake Toho Nutrient Reduction Plan in 2011. As a part of that, we are monitoring our watersheds. And I will tell you that the city of Kissimmee has made a major investment in monitoring Chamber Creek, Mill Slough, and their watersheds, and they have flow monitoring on those stations. We looked into putting in flow-weighted monitoring. Our biggest issue is cost. It's $100,000 per station, and you have to get a good location to get these stations put in. Additionally, Orange County and Reedy Creek Improvement District, under their Phase 1 NPDES permits, are required to continue monitoring above and beyond what we do in Osceola and Kissimmee and St. Cloud. So it is happening. That data is available. We just entered an agreement, a formal agreement with South Florida Water Management District. They are providing us laboratory services. We are doing the collection. So it is happening. The data is available. DEP has been using it for a very long time.
Thank you for that comment.
That's actually one of our governing board's big things right now, is they want transparency on the past. Anything that we're collecting.
Nyla Price again. So can you go back to that slide with all the bubbles that show the overlay about how the different agencies work together in this process? On my way over here driving 70, I was on the phone talking to somebody who is also involved in this water conversation. And I was talking to him about the fact that in all of this, one of the challenges that we all face, and I know sometimes I'm a little hard on you guys, and I don't need to be, is that we have so many different lanes of travel, and we're all trying to get to the same location, and it seems like we're sort of in and out, and there's a lot of bureaucracy. In this process, I think it's really important that we try to give as much information as possible in one location so that people see where those intersections are between these various agencies and how they work. Because even those of us who live, eat, sleep, and breathe this conversation sometimes struggle to understand where things are going to come from, which agency's handling it, how that looks. The people of Florida really want to get past bureaucracy, and that's not a criticism, it just is what it is. We have huge problems, and we're not moving fast enough. And it's very difficult for the average homeowner, landowner, Florida native, Floridian who's just arrived and is trying to learn, to figure out this bureaucracy. And so what you get in a public process is people who come in, myself included, sort of like Wreck-It Ralph. We just want to bust through the walls and get to work. So if you can help us to communicate a little more clearly so that we know that the monitoring in Osceola County is going to be applied in a little more visual, quick, easy way, I think it's going to make your process for these ongoing workshops a little easier. Thank you. And thanks for your patience with me.
Thank you. I sometimes have a hard time finding things on the website, so certainly understand your point. If there are no more questions, we plan to stay for a while after the meeting so that you are more comfortable, so that we can have Thanks for taking time today.